Good afternoon. Ambassador K. Samapandi, President of Singapore Indian Association and Distinguished Affiliated Fellow of the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Her Excellency Mrs. Vijay Thakur Singh, Indian Ambassador, Indian High Commissioner to Singapore, Professor Vinita Sinha, the South Asian Studies Program at National University of Singapore, and Dr. Rajesh Rai, author of the book that we are launching, Indians in Singapore, 1890 to 1945, Diaspora in the Colonial Port City. Distinguished guests, on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I warmly welcome you to this book launch event, Indians in Singapore, 1819 to 1945, Diaspora in the Colonial Port City. The author, Dr. Rajesh Rai, is also Assistant Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies and Assistant Professor at the South Asian Studies Program at the National University of Singapore. The launch of this book will be followed by a panel discussion. But to begin this afternoon's proceedings, I now invite Professor Sinha to make opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. Welcome to this afternoon's event. I'm very pleased and very honored indeed to start the proceedings this afternoon. This is a very special afternoon when my colleague Dr. Rajesh Rai's book will be launched officially. Of course, we've seen the book already and we're very proud of him for this wonderful achievement. But let me begin formally by welcoming you and the guest of honor, Ambassador K. Samapandi, for kindly agreeing to grace this event. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and Her Excellency Mrs. Vijay Thakur, Indian High Commissioner to Singapore. Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. This is a momentous occasion for many reasons. Rajesh is very well known in the scholarly community as well as the Indian community in Singapore, and I think his commitment to the scholarly study of the Indian community has been well documented by now, and his enthusiasm for continuing to work in this field is also very much appreciated by a small group of scholars who have been doggedly trying to sort of uncover and excavate the history of the Indian community in Singapore. Unfortunately, the scholarship on this community remains till date marginal and limited, and there's so much more that can be done. And indeed, the very small Indian community on the island is a dynamic and multifaceted community that demands greater scholarly engagement. So, as a small group of students of Indian society, and I consider myself a student of Indian society in Singapore, I very much appreciate Rajesh's efforts to persist and continue to uncover facets of Indian history, history of the Indian community in Singapore, and one evidence of that is shown in the book before us. So thank you very much, Rajesh. I really don't have very much to say by way of opening remarks, except to say that I think this is a momentous occasion, and I think this book is going to become a resource for students of Indian community in Singapore in time to come, and this work really adds to the tremendous body of work that Rajesh has already produced in his capacity as a historian of Singapore. And of course, he's not just looking at the Indian community in Singapore in a vacuum or in a limited sense, but this is really part of his effort to engage the broader field of diaspora studies, and he's contributed quite a bit of his own time to doing that. So this is really coming at, I won't say the tail end, but it's coming at a point when he's already accumulated quite a bit of expertise on the study of diaspora communities, and I think this effort must be appreciated and applauded. So I commend you, Rajesh, for doing this, and we expect to see more work in the years to come. Thank you very much. And let me, with that, I'm basically going to chair the proceedings this afternoon, so it is my great pleasure to invite Ambassador K. Samapandi to deliver his opening remarks to us. Professor.
many of us know each other. And more importantly, dear friends and well-wishers of Dr. Rai. Dear friends and well-wishers of Dr. Rai, I am privileged to be given this opportunity to say a few words and help to launch this book, which is making a timely appearance. I say timely because there is so much interest in all things Indian, both domestically and abroad. The resurgence of India, brought about by the advent of the Modi government, will have an impact on Indians everywhere, including Indians in Singapore. The recording of the history of postmodern Indians in Southeast Asia is studded with names like Nilakanta Sastri, R.C. Majmudar, S. Rasaratnam, Karnal Singh Sandhu, Wangkano, Ramasamy, and A. Mani, and including the host of footnotes in this book that we have launched. So veritably, it's a very rich history there. And joining this illustrious academic procession is our young Dr. Rajesh Rai with his book, Indians in Singapore. However, Dr. Rai, unlike the other names I mentioned earlier, chose to focus his study on a particular country, Singapore, rather than on a wider geographical area of Southeast Asia or Malaya as a joint geographical entity. Most of the books have been pan-region or pan-Malayan. This has allowed the author to explore in depth many facets of the developments in Singapore's history, which has helped to surface new interpretations of the period that we are talking about, 1890 to 1945. And most strikingly, and for me, Dr. Rai has chosen to base his research on Singapore being a port city. And the impact of that on the region. Now, why I say it's particularly of interest to me, because I've been one of those trying to set up Maritime Heritage Center. So this contribution from Dr. Rai to that literature is very, very important. Now, hitherto, Singapore was viewed as an appendage of Greater India, Majmudar's term, or in more recent times, part of the Malaysian space, or Malayan space, by the work by Professor S. Rasaratnam. This novel approach of looking at Singapore as a port city has led the author to draw several remarkable conclusions, which I hope he will no doubt enlighten us in his presentation. Today, Indians in Singapore live in Singapore amidst conditions of peace and racial harmony. We have been spared the horrors of racial and religious prejudices that have torn apart and are still tearing apart societies everywhere or elsewhere. As the book describes vividly, this was not always the case. Starting from the founding of Singapore by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819, the various races lived in distinct geographical areas. This was a deliberate policy. That's how Little India came about, Chinatown came about, the Malay settlements in Geylang came about. The locations largely depended on the occupations and livelihood, creating at times ghetto-like mentalities, which in turn created social tensions. But all these changed by two events. One, the 1857 crisis in India, and the 1915 Indian Sepoy Mutiny here in Singapore. These were catalysts for change, both on the part of the European missions and other races, and for Indians in particular. Due to time constraints, I will not relate, but I can assure you that Dr. Rai has dealt in depth both these crises and the impact that it made. Now, this is what he puts it in a nutshell. The period before World War I has seen a gradual increase of organizational activity within the Indian population in Singapore. A concurrent development was that of a moderate brand of political bargaining that involved the presenting of petitions and representations to the government, of which gaining religious, social, and educational privileges were its aims. And I was happy to read in the book the role played by the Singapore Indian Association and the Indian Independence League. Mr. Mujumoboy's father was one of the leading proponents in making these representations and change. Now, in the interest of time, let me move forward to the next catalytic change which impacted on the people of Singapore, including the Indian community. World War II and the surrender by the British of their impregnable fortress. For 4 years, the people of Singapore were witness to the barbaric cruelty of the Japanese. It is said that the Indian community had it light when it came to the suffering endured by the population. However, Dr. Rai highlights that Indians too had a share of the suffering during this traumatic period. Now, amidst this orgy of cruelty perpetrated by the Japanese, came the heroism of Indian nationalism outside the shores of India. Various bodies like the Indian Independence League, Singapore Indian Association, and others were established to channel the aspirations of the Indians in Singapore towards the fight for independence in the motherland. It was, however, the establishment of the Indian National Army and its women's wing, Rani of Jhansi, or Jhansi Regiment, and the arrival of Subhash Chandra Bose, which galvanized the Indian community into action. For those of you who have not read the book by Niranjana Sengupta, it's a must. It's called A Gentleman's Word, which encapsulates the period, this vital period of our history. But coming back to Dr. Rai, he describes this period as follows, quote, "The coming of Subhash Chandra Bose completely revolutionized the whole movement because people had great confidence in him." Dr. Rai vividly assesses the impact of Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA on the Indian population. Notwithstanding the outcome of World War II, developments in India will forever be enshrined in Singapore's history and reflected appropriately in the Indian Heritage Center, which will be opened early next year. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai is the chairman of that committee, so it's his job to make sure it's appropriately. Dear friends, members of our generation will be familiar with many of the developments that Dr. Rai has written about in his book. However, I fear that it will be tabula rasa to the younger generations of Singaporeans in general and Indians in particular. In fact, just now somebody said my daughter doesn't even know who is Mahatma Gandhi. So can you imagine if you don't know that, what else are you going to do? But as I said earlier, the Indian community in Singapore today is a confident community, living and working on par with the other communities. However, new challenges are emerging which the country and its people have to face. Again, quote Dr. Rai, quote, "These would grow increasingly complex in time to come. even as new imperatives and movements embellish the already elaborate texture of the diaspora in the port city. The question of overcrowding is one of them, the question of new immigrants is another one of them. These are issues that the community, Indian community, has to come to grips with. Remembering and learning from the lessons of the past would be important in addressing the challenges of the future. Now that Dr. Rai has done his part, for which we congratulate him most heartily, we must do our part, that making sure that the fruit of his labor is widely known, especially to the younger generation. For this, I have a simple recipe. Buy one book and buy one more for a friend. The happy news is we have already on order nearly 200 copies of the book. Today, only 80 books are available. The rest will be given in the later part. Now, on that note, allow me to commend this book to all of you present and those who have come to hear it. Reflecting the times and spirit of the book, let me wish you all joy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kesavapani. Now, to formally launch the book, I would like to invite Ambassador Pillai and Dr. Rajesh Rai on the stage to join Ambassador Kesavapani and Dr. while you remain there. Thank you. Now that marks the official launch of the book. Can I remind those who have got a copy yet that the copy of the book is available for sale at the back of the room for $30. To join Dr. Rajesh Rai and Professor Sinha, can I invite Dr. Lavanya Nakhiravelu, Assistant Professor at the Division of Sociology, School of Humanities and Social Science, Nanyang Technology University, and Dr. Sindha Pal Singh, Senior Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies. This panel will be chaired by Professor Sinha, and I is over to you.
So well known when I came to introduce him, but I think everybody knows him very well in the community. He's, of course, the former director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and represented Singapore internationally in many community organizations. And his contribution has been well appreciated, and of course, currently the Singapore Indian Association and many other things. The other reason I wanted to introduce him was that it had taken too long. And the second omission, I should have mentioned that this event is jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies and the South Asian Studies program at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, National University of Singapore. So I'm very happy to move to the next stage of this event, which is a panel discussion. And I'm very pleased to be joined by the panelists and the author himself and the guest of honor. I think the way that this is going to happen is that Rajesh will begin by saying a few words about the book, and then we will hand it over to Lavanya and Sindha, introduce later. And then we will take questions from the audience, and we will try and moderate the events in such a way that there's sufficient time for people to ask questions, because I think that is a very important part of this afternoon's event. So let me introduce Dr. Rajesh Rai, who is an assistant professor. He has many credentials. He is an assistant professor at the South Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. He's also an assistant director at the Institute of South Asian Studies. I'm very pleased to name him as one of my friends and colleagues and fellow students of Indian society. So let me invite first Rajesh to say a few words about the book and perhaps the experience of writing the book. Thank you.
today by your presence. I'm honored today also to have this book launched at the National Museum. It is such a historic site. 150 years ago, if there were windows here, and we looked out of those windows, we would look upon the convict prison. Today, of course, it's the ground of the Singapore Management University. Indian transported convicts were based here. At that time, maybe about 2,500 of them. At this time of the year, maybe just a few weeks earlier, they would have been out in a procession. 1,000, maybe more at this time. Muharram processions. On the streets of just in front of us. If we turn left, tilted our head a little, look north a little, we will see the actual dhobis based at Dhobiwar, the washing. And just where they were based would also be a temple, the Sivan temple. Looking east a little, we'd see the Bengali mosque. It is no longer there. To the south would be the magnificent St. Andrew's Cathedral, built by the hands of the convicts themselves. And west of that, the river, where the Indian boatmen were based. Beyond that, the densely populated Chinatown, where too there were many pockets of Indians. It is the great heterogeneity, the richness of the Indian presence here that drew me to this project. That long history, which I grew up in, was part of the reason. The other was the very experience of living in England for 5 years. There I found too another, what they label as the Asian community, effectively people from the subcontinent, but whose identities were very different from mine. And I wondered, why the difference? And it is when one views such a mirror that one begins to reflect on ourselves. And it is from there that my journey into the study of Indians in Singapore began. I was lucky. When I came back to Singapore, I'd finished a doctorate on Hindutva nationalism. I met Professor Peter Reeves, and he says, well, you know, I'm sorry, we don't really have places there, but are you interested in the diaspora? And I said, yes, yes. And through that, I got my first job in academia. And since then, I've gone on to study South Asians in Singapore, indeed to some extent globally, was involved in the Encyclopedia of the Indian Diaspora project. And at the end of it, Professor Reeves told me it's time to go on Indians in Singapore. Now that I've told you the process of getting into this book, which is about 10 years in the making, the writing itself took 2 years plus, let me try and tell you why I think it's a little different from what we have read so far. As Ambassador Pani has already mentioned, much of our history, the history of Singapore, is intertwined with that of Malay. There is no doubt about it. And indeed, as a result of our conjoined histories, much of the history of this island that has now been independent coming to 50 years is really often placed at the periphery of the wider Indian history. And what I wanted to do was to extract what was it that made up the Singapore elements. It becomes very, very difficult for a person studying the diaspora to do. After all, Indians didn't land here directly. They went to Penang, unlike the Chinese migrants. The Chinese migrants were landed. This immediately underscores to you the difficulties, for example, in trying to enumerate the number of Indians who were traveling to Penang and then from there to Singapore, because the same records were not properly captured. So I wanted to find the distinguishing features and to root out the specific history of the Indians here. It has been a difficult task. But as I began to look into the material, several features came to the fore. And these are some of the threads that tie the book together. Firstly, it is in many senses a distinctive diaspora, even by global standards. If you look at, for example, the movement of large numbers of Indians to the colonies, to Mauritius, to Trinidad, and so on and so forth. Much of the communities there were formed out of a specific movement that occurred during the colonial period and largely connected to plantation labor and indenture. If you look at the South Asian or Indian movement to the west, it is overwhelmingly a movement that has taken place after the Second World War. The interesting thing about the Singapore case is that we have both these movements. We have a movement that took place in the colonial period, not just of indentured workers, but of merchants and traders and servicemen, a great heterogeneity there. But we have a movement that continues to this day, from 1890 onwards. It makes for a very multi-layered diaspora. The second thing that I think I want to highlight, in addition to the fact that this is a very multi-layered diaspora, is that it is, as Ambassador Pani already mentioned, a port city, an urban space. From very early on, although the settlement, Singapore town itself may have been small, 3 square miles for a good 40 years of its initial existence around this area. But even from that time, this was a concentrated space, subject to colonial policies that sought to manage its control, sustain its control through policies that emphasized divide and rule. Now, such policies were put in place in other colonies as well. But the difference here was this was in a tight urban setting. A setting in which the Indian diaspora was one of multiple diasporas, in which you had to negotiate your identity in a context where differences were very proximate to you, that at points may have enabled hybridities to emerge, that at points may also have accentuated differences. And these are some of the things that I've sought to uncover within this book. Thirdly, the port city, Singapore, and I would include within this also Penang, also the Rangoon. These were connected places. This is not the distant plantation frontier where people remembered India in nostalgia and attempted to recreate their culture based on nostalgia of the homeland. This was not just remembered. Here in the port city, Indians who reproduced their culture here had their umbilical cord firmly attached to the home. They moved to and fro. They were a mobile population. And when newspapers began to move here, as certainly by the 1850s, you find that they were well aware of events that were occurring in India. And so, their religious and cultural production, their identities were not divorced from the homeland. Even if they were afar, they were connected. And this is another feature of the diaspora in the port city. Now, I promised my friends that they would have adequate time. Dr. Lavanya will be looking at the first two parts of the book, and maybe I should mention the structure of the book, which is divided into three parts that follow very closely from the evolution of Singapore's socio-political history. The first part is 1890 to 1867, when Singapore is a part, effectively most of which, during which Singapore is a part of British India. From 1867 to 1941, when the Strait settlements come under, directly under the Crown, and then from 1941 to 45, which is the Japanese occupation. Now, Lavanya will very kindly do the first two parts, and Dr. Sindapal Singh will speak about the third part, which is on the International Army and the Japanese occupation. And for me, it's a good moment because now that the book is done and some of the sales are done, maybe it's good to hear some of the criticism as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh, for a very succinct introduction to the book and for keeping to time. Appreciate that. I'm very pleased now to turn to the two panelists who have agreed to speak about the book, and I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Dr. Lavanya Kathirvelu, who's an assistant professor at the Division of Sociology at the Nanyang Technological University. She's eminently qualified to comment on this, and perhaps we're looking at the next generation who might be studying the Indian society and taking it into newer directions. Lavanya.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? So, thanks very much for that very kind introduction. I don't know if I'm eminently qualified, but I must say up front, I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist. So perhaps that qualifies me in special ways to talk about this book. So my interest comes from a more contemporary interest in the Indian diaspora in Singapore, but elsewhere as well. So I'm not going to summarize the chapters for you because, of course, you're going to read the book, right? So I'm just going to pick out some key points that I think are significant in the first four chapters of the book, and perhaps Rajesh can comment on them. They're not really questions, more comments, so perhaps we can pick them up later in the question and answer session. So, as already mentioned, this is a much-needed empirical contribution to the literature on the diaspora, primarily because, as Professor Pani already mentioned, it focuses on Singapore and Singaporean Indians. But in contrast to lots of historical studies on the diaspora that tell a kind of colonial history, or narratives, for instance, Amitav Ghosh, who writes through the eyes of the individual migrant, I think this book inhabits a kind of happy middle space. So it is, of course, still a in large parts of the history of colonial intervention in the region, but also importantly, I think it's a vernacular retelling of the social networks and of the collective cultural reproduction that characterizes the Indian diaspora in Singapore. So what do I mean by cultural reproduction, right? So, for example, the book details the formation and development of political and religious institutions in Singapore, and these institutions took on a key role of forming a diaspora consciousness, and I think Rajesh lays this out very well. For example, in chapter 2, there's an extensive discussion of the various community efforts in constructed shrines and temples, as well as in street festivals, as Rajesh mentioned before. And in chapter 5, again, he picks up and talks about, for instance, the formation of Tham Marisa, which is our leading Tamil newspaper. And the influence of the Dravidian movement is also well laid out in this chapter. So these are some of the ways in which these transnational links from South Asia, from India, were felt in Singapore, but also reinterpreted and reinscribed on our own cultural landscape here in different ways. And I think this is a key contribution of the book in showing this and demonstrating this and pulling out the uniqueness of this Singaporean Indian cultural reproduction of identity. My second point kind of follows on from the first, in talking about this community, and the point is about continuity. Right? So as a sociologist, I'm interested in contemporary. And in reading this book, what struck me was so much of the continuity from the past in how we imagine and how we read the Indian community today. Right? So, so Rajesh talks about change, right? He said, look out the window and see how much the physical landscape has changed. But in terms of the cultural landscape of our Indian community, I want to suggest, and maybe you will agree or disagree, that there's actually lots of continuity in the ways in which the Indian community functions today. Right? So one key point is that the title of the book is Indians in Singapore. And early on in the book, Rajesh tells us that this is a very self-conscious choice, right? He chose to call it Indians in Singapore and not South Asians in Singapore. And why he does this, I think it's really clever. And he does this because he says, when we say Indian in Singapore, we don't just think of North Indians or South Indians. We think of people from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and from Sri Lanka as well. So he's reappropriating this vernacular in the title of his book. And I think this is key as well, because he talks not just about what is India, migrants from what is India today, but he also incorporates in his book the narratives and experiences of Sri Lankans and people from other parts of the diaspora. However, he doesn't homogenize this Indian experience, right? So one of the key successes of his book, I think, is in showing diversity of the Indian experience. Right, so this diversity, which is again apparent today in the Indian community, I think in one way he shows this is through tensions within the community. So at the same time though, he also shows unity. And this is, as you mentioned before, contextual and it's dynamic, so it's shifting. It's not one linear narrative of disparate, different Indian groups that come together in the end to become the Singaporean Indian community, but as we all know, the community now is also divided but also unified in different ways, and I think he shows this continuity. And for me, as a scholar of contemporary Singapore, it's really exciting to see that there is this kind of historical continuity. So one of the key ways, I think one of the really interesting ways in which he shows unity within the community is, for example, how the Indian community bands together to protest against the banning of public processions and festivals, for example. But he also talks about the tensions, for example, between different class groups within the community. And one of the points as well that he makes is not just about relations within the Indian community or tensions within the Indian community, but he also talks about relationships with other communities in Singapore. So again, I think this complicates the narrative about separate communities, the Indians, the Chinese, the Malays, living these separate, almost parallel lives, right? And I think his narrative complicates this a little bit because he shows, for example, how the secret societies, so Indian secret societies as well as Chinese secret societies work together. And I think this is also a really exciting part of our history, to think of these inter-ethnic collaborations that have existed for centuries. Right? So finally, the last point I want to pull out is about the chronological ordering of the book. Right? So I think this is really interesting because part 1 and part 2 of the book that I've kind of been tasked with talking about are divided along the line of 1867 is the key dividing date that he takes to differentiate part 1 from part 2, right? And when I was reading it, when I first looked at the contents, I thought, why this 1867? Why is this significant, right? And it's significant in the context of diaspora because, as Rajesh mentioned before, the shift that Singapore was governed pre-1867 by as part of the British Indian government, and then it was governed separately from the Crown as part of the Straits Settlements after 1867. So why is this shift important in the context of diaspora? Right? So diaspora as you all know, is about the movements of people, right? So after 1867, the movements of Indians from India to, or from South Asia to Singapore was restricted. Because prior to this, the movement of Indians from India to Singapore was seen as an internal movement because they were all under the same government, right? So there was, and Rajesh points this out in his book, it's actually very hard to find records of this movement because it was classified as internal. But post-1867, there were actually restrictions placed, and so it was much harder for people to move, right? And why is this significant? I think it's significant because I think this marks, and perhaps Rajesh can again agree or disagree with me here, I think this marks perhaps the formation or the solidification of a diaspora consciousness, because there is then an awareness of moving outside, outside this jurisdiction of India into a different space, right? And I think in this way, then the book can be seen as not just about diaspora, but also about citizenship and the formation of a modern individual consciousness of diaspora. So as Rajesh mentioned before, part of this awareness was about being part of a larger diasporic Indian movement that encompassed Burma, and Penang, so other parts of Southeast Asia. But, and also the kind of victimization, but also the enabling or the benefits that came with being a colonial subject of a large empire, like the British Empire. But I think this 1867 point that he pulls out is really key because it marks not just the formation of a Singaporean diaspora, Indian diaspora, but I think it can perhaps, it's significant also because it comes before ideas of a Singaporean citizenship. So this is really, I think, a key contribution that the book makes. And I'm going to leave it at that, those 3 points, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Lavanya. And so Rajesh, as you reflect on those comments and perhaps prepare your responses to them, let me invite Dr. Sindipal Singh, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and after hearing from a sociologist, I look forward to his intervention as a political scientist who works on international relations and in particular Singapore-India foreign relations. So over to your expertise.
Thanks, Mika. Thank you, Rajesh, firstly, for being a part of this. At the outset, let me just say that a lot of times when you read academic accounts, historical accounts, it's very difficult to satisfy both sides. Either your peers like your book, or people who are non-experts like your book. But I think in Rajesh's case, he's managed to satisfy both sides. I think in terms of the historical rigor, it's amazing. And also the small stories that he tells. Very nicely, he weaves small little stories into his account. And of course, overall is a very highly readable book. So I will just concentrate on the last part, the Japanese occupation period. In true Singapore style, I have 3 points to make. The first is, what I thought was really interesting was how Rajesh weaves the story of the INA and the story of the Indian community in Singapore together. Most accounts of this period treat the histories of the INA and the history of the Indian community in Singapore as separate accounts, separate histories. They come for mention. I mean, so the history of the INA will talk a bit about, at least, about the Indian community in Singapore, and vice versa, history of the Indian community in Singapore will have something to say about the INA. What Rajesh has managed to do, what Rajesh has managed to do is, first, not only add the kind of context that's needed to the history of the Indian community in Singapore, but he also has demonstrated, I think, very well that you cannot talk about one without talking about the other. And I think that is one of the major contributions of the book. That from now on, academics will find it very difficult to talk about the history of the Indian community in Singapore during this period without talking about the history of the INA. That's one. My second point is, Ambassador Kesavapani touched on it, and I'll just elaborate. There's this notion in popular representations of Singapore's history during the Japanese period that Rajesh puts it the Indians suffered less badly. Right, Rajesh? Is that right? Indians suffered less badly. And I think Rajesh very persuasively tries to challenge this notion. And for example, he demonstrates how those Indian POWs who refused to join the INA were either packed off to build the Thailand-Burma railway. Most of them never to return. The rest were tortured by Japanese forces in Singapore. And also, I think Rajesh goes a bit further. He explains how, you know, the period of Subhash Chandra Bose, the total mobilization campaign, the financial drain on the Indian community is a very interesting point he makes, where a lot of the money that could have gone for welfare activities during this period is in fact spent on the war. And of course, the other point about the lives that were lost for in the Impal campaign and the battle for Burma. And again, in his own very special way, the small histories that Rajesh picks up that I never knew about this, about Indians being relocated during this period. And he talks about how some Indians were relocated to Bintan Island. I mean, of course, Bintan Island now might be slightly different from the 1944 Bintan Island, I assume. And yeah, I think now I wouldn't mind being relocated there for a while. But 1944, and he talks about how life was so difficult for this group of Indians who were relocated there. That's the second point. I think it's a really interesting contribution, that challenging this notion that you say the Indians suffered less badly. I think you challenge it very well. The last, and I think probably what I think is the best part of this section is how you treat the question, what motivated Indians to join the INA? A lot of times, historians, even political scientists, cannot resist the urge to say, these are the various factors, but this is the most important. I think Rajesh manages to resist that temptation, to present the range of motivations. So they range from what would be the very standard kind of motivations, fighting for the freedom of India, feelings of patriotism, the charisma of Subhash Chandra Bose. But then you also point out that, you know, another reason that some Indians were attracted, some was for self-preservation, so the Japanese were treated slightly better than the rest. Also, others were leaders of the Indian community at this time thought that in order to take care of their own community, if they supported the INA or joined the INA, then the people in their community will suffer less, which I think again is a very interesting point. And the good thing is the way you present it. I thought you resist the urge to say, oh, this is more important, that is more important. You explain how, as in most social realities, how the complexity occurs again and again. And you weave that narrative very nicely, you jump from one to the other. I mean, another small reason, a small factor, you explain how Captain Mohan Singh, how he's stepping down from Mohan, right? Yeah. So I looked at you and thought,
I hope you read the book.
Yeah, I did. And how Captain Mohan Singh, when he was removed from the INA, how the Sikhs decided to, not support the INA. So again, small little histories, but weave together very nicely. So those are basically my 3 points. Now I got something which I want to talk about in terms of what you've done and what we can do from here. Maybe you're a victim of your own success because you've written such an engaging narrative. Then I think at the end you tease us a little bit. Ambassador Pani read the last paragraph of the conclusion. And even the last paragraph of the last section, where you sort of start to hint that things are going to change. I think one hint I think you give is Indians in Singapore will be increasingly less and less affected by what happens in India. That's one hint I got. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a comment later. And number 2, that the story will become much more interesting in a sense. So now, I have to push you, and I think maybe I do it before Vinita pushes you. What after this? Because you stop at 45, actually you stop at about 47, I think. See, I read the book. But there's another interesting, until 59 at least. I mean, I know the issue of records and archives and all that, but until 59, there's still some scope. And I think after reading this, you'll be asking you for more because, as I said, you give at the end, you sort of tease us a bit. So if you want to hear what you think you can do with this story again. Again, Rajesh, thank you, and I look forward to hearing what you're going to say about the last part. Thanks.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think Rajesh has been pushed, but before he responds, so that this doesn't become a one-sided thing, I would like to open this up to the audience because I think we have a room full of very interested people. I see many familiar faces and perhaps many questions. So may I invite questions for the panel, the panelists, the author, and our guest of honor. And before you ask the question or make a comment, if you would like, please do just introduce yourself. Thank you. Do we have microphones? Yes, please.
My name is Kansupen. I just want to know what is the social milieu in which all this happened. Is it a very benign colonial government that allows you to do whatever you want to do? Practice your religion, have your Deepavali festival and so on, and have your dance and so on. Whereas if you were a suppressive government, then I don't think all these things are possible. So can you comment on that? I can't wondering because for the Chinese to come here also, the same thing happened. They allow them to do whatever they want. But assuming we are very strong like communist government, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, then all these things would not happen. Can you comment on that?
Thank you. What I would propose is that we collect a series of questions and then we can ask the panel to respond. So may I hear more views and questions, please? Please do stand up. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Nilanjana Sengupta. This is for Rajesh. This is a bit of a selfish question. As a researcher and writer, I would like to know, you said that you very carefully distinguished the Singapore and the Malaysian histories. So how did you actually go about it? What were your specific methods of research by which you could root out the history of Singapore? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope the panelists are taking notes about it. Yeah, okay, great. More, please. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on what Tan asked just now about the cultural perspective, or if I may, the religious perspective. I heard just now Rajesh mentioned that among the elected convicts, they celebrated Muharram. So I assume that there were Muslims among the convicts. But is it maybe because they are so tolerant that even the Hindus celebrate Muharram, the first month of the Muslim calendar? So how much of the religious perspective or the cultural perspective is actually covered in this book? If I may, for example, just cite an anecdote. When I was in Delhi and I went to Han Market, and I saw, I think I mentioned this before, I saw a set of encyclopedia, and I took out one volume, and the first page I opened was about the Marikas, who came to Singapore, about 45,000 people. So how much of the Muslim perspective of the Indians are actually captured in this book? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can take a few. Let me take 2 more questions. That will be the first round, and then we'll take another round. Can I have a couple of other comments, please? Related? Unrelated? Okay, so let me revert back to the panel. So I'm going to ask Rajesh and each of the panelists actually to respond to the question.
Okay. What is the social milieu in this happen? I think, like the issue of identity, this is very contextual and depends on which period of colonial rule we are talking about. If we are looking at the period pre-1867, the British administration is skeletal. This is really a community of about 300 plus Europeans, dependent on Indian troops, well, at least up to 1857, to sustain sustain their authority here. So it's a skeletal administration. It does employ policies that seek to, if we want to call it simply, to divide and rule, but at the same time, its ability to manage and discipline the Asian communities is very limited. So this is how I see the situation certainly up to 1967. And that is why precisely I say 150 years plus ago. The Muharram processions, thousands would be on the streets. Diaspora would follow in a week's time, with also Hindu and Muslim participants. Now, the British begin to tighten control somewhat, really from 1857 on. Just slightly before 1867, they are very concerned about processions, especially. Religious processions is, well, partly they see such carnivalesque activities as going against, Victorian ethos, and so on and so forth. They begin to then try and tighten it. That tightening increases gradually, so that these processions become smaller and smaller scale. Over time, you keep them within largely private spaces with special permissions granted, for example, to Thaipusam and so on and so forth. Now, they become tighter still post the 1915 Indian Sepoy Mutiny. At that point in time, the special branch is founded. It becomes the basis for today the CID and so on and so forth, when you actively have spies watching on the activities of others. So I think what we see here is variations during the colonial period over time. At the early stages, in as much as they may have wanted the control, would not have had the resources to do. And gradually there was a tightening. But even as they tightened, the flow of political currents and socio-political currents from India and beyond, Turkey and elsewhere, still led to many instances of resistance. Over time, a populace more willing to challenge colonial authority in the development of trade unionism and so on, especially in the aftermath of the Great Depression. So I guess the answer I would say is that there are variations at points, very limited at the beginning, over time, tighter control, but at the same time influenced by currents so that people, the population became also more belligerent in challenging that authority. Now, I hope that answers your question somewhat. Let me take, before I go into the methods question, which Nilanjana posited, how much of the Muslim story is in this story? So I cannot ignore the Muslim story. It is, in 1849, a census was done. 78.5% of the civilians, Indian civilian population was Muslim. That's a shocking statistic. 78.5% of the Indian population in Singapore, civilian population. I'm not talking about the troops, I'm not talking about the convicts. But the civilian population, 78.5%. Indeed, if you're talking about the early development of the Indian community, here, the story of Indian Muslims is central. And this is everywhere evident in so many of the old shrines. And I have tried, as far as I can, to unpack some of them. There are possibly better scholars than me. Thorsten is certainly one who is focused very closely on the Tamil Muslim community. But I think that certainly in the first in fact in most of the chapters you will find that the Indian Muslim story is very significant. Even in a period as they become the minority within the Indian community, how Indians had to negotiate as they attempted to unify the community politically or otherwise, with drawing Muslims into the movement. For example, Subhash Chandra Bose's Pune. So this does feature. I hope it will meet us. As a research methods and archives, very difficult. Is the simple answer. But I have been helped in this process, partly because so much of it now is on, even primary records are now electronic. So that really helps. I could spend, I made visits to UK to extricate. Let me give you an example, labor records. Those to some extent are possible. But where do we look? Right? Indian Immigration Department is in Penang. Now, how do you then get records of those who came from Penang and Singapore? Surprisingly, the place to go in many instances was the Chinese Protectorate records. After all, it is the Ministry of Manpower, right? And that was where Indian records of Indian laborers, not all, but those who were licensed, brought by licensed Kanganis, those who were brought by indentured, especially in the period after 1880s, is kept quite closely. So you do get some of it. There are some elements that are impossible to tell. Traders moving across this region, you will not get records of exact numbers. I hope somebody finds that out. I doubt it. But you can go into, and especially as the records start becoming thicker from 1870s onwards, gradually the records become more concrete. Then you can begin to, just based on yearly census data, start figuring it out. It is a painful process, but somehow I enjoy doing that. These were things that I like digging out. So my answer is, I think that you will, the book will show you that you can actually get more data than we've got. And I think in the future, hopefully we can uncover more by looking at a lot of stuff that is either primary records electronically or by going to the Indian archives in UK and so on.
Thanks, Rajesh. The best case would like to say something?
Just in response to the query by my good friend, Mr. Tan. Actually, it's a luck of the draw. By which I mean, who colonized us? It could very well have been the Dutch. And the Dutch had their own way of handling. It could have been the French as an image. And the French policy was to make every native a little Frenchman. But in the case of the British or English, as long as they put you in a little part of the place and got a captain to look after you, but in the case of Chinatown, they had a captain China. And so long as you didn't create problems, you could do what you liked. So that's why the communities were allowed to do whatever they like within their own confines. It's only when they crisscrossed and there were problems, then the administration stepped in. That's why you see, even in Chinatown, you have a mosque, you have a temple, you have a... why? Because not my problem, so long as you can manage it. In various other parts of Singapore, you have that. So basically, as I said, it's a lot of the law, and we were lucky to come under the British. The rule of law and language, which accounts for what we are. On Zandel's question, I read the book very carefully. So, the Wahhabi board to regulate Muslim affairs was set up earlier than even the Hindu. And there's a litany of names about Muslim personalities who had contributed to various, you mention all the Muslim names, every one of them.
Thank you, Ambassador Kesavani. Lavanya, would you like to say something? Or, yes.
So in addition to what Rajesh said about the first question about what kind of social milieu, right, of the colonial administration and the restrictions that they placed on, you know, for instance, public possessions. Also, post-67, one of the key points he makes is about the protection, actually, of Indian labor. And the restrictions placed on migration were partly to do with trying to protect Indians because there was seen to be exploitative conditions sometimes in migration and in the straight settlements. So there was an element of benign kind of protection as well. I mean, it didn't always work out that way in practice, but there was a discourse around it.
Just on the question about colonial policy, I think in the book, one interesting thing that comes true is that colonial policy in India as well had an effect on in Singapore. So how the colonial authority dealt with different religious, cultural groups. So you cannot see Singapore in isolation by itself. You cannot ask the question, how did the colonial authorities in Singapore deal with the Indian community in Singapore by itself? So Rajesh very cleverly shows how the impact from India impacts Singapore.
Thank you very much. I would like to take more questions. We have time, and another round of comments, perhaps. Yes, please, Joshua.
Hi, I'm Chitra Shukri. I'm from the English department in NUS. Rajesh, let me first congratulate you on a very, very readable and eminently well-researched book. Thank you for giving this to us. My question, I would like to take up from the point you made about how you went to London and you discovered that though we are in a diaspora, the Asian diaspora in the UK is really different, and therefore, in a sense, you felt you had a distinctive identity. So, with regard to that, I would like to probe that a little more, particularly with regard to the kind of tensions that you mentioned. I think Ravani also hit on that, within the community and so on. Do you feel that, when you talk about continuity, do you feel that there were any specific kinds of tensions that were there within the Indian community at that point in time when you were talking about the tensions? And do you feel that there is a continuing reflection of that tension within the Indian community? I think I'm talking about the anxiety that most minority communities and most diasporic communities feel about the changing phase of their identity. And I think that is something that contemporary Singaporeans across the board feel. And I think it's particularly relevant to the Indian diasporic community in Singapore. So would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
Rajesh, since it's been directed at you, I think you should answer that now. No, I think you should answer it now.
I have to talk about this. I don't know whether I will be able to answer your question. I'll try. One of the things that I noticed very clearly when I was in England, and that allowed me to reflect on it, was really how central religious and, in some senses, religious political identities were essential to the Asian communities. I think and there are those many here in the audience who spent many years in the UK. How it mattered that you're Indian, or Pakistani, that you're Muslim or Hindu. It's very central to the identity of the diaspora there. And in Singapore, even if I have no issues whatsoever in terms of practicing my religion, and that was important to me. But we didn't grow up on the basis of these lines. What was evident to me as I grew up was that in Singapore, North and South matters. In UK, it didn't. I don't know, it has changed since I left, maybe, but it didn't. And these And one history is, in the UK case, is really a diaspora that is produced post-partition. And ours is a diaspora that has at points in time been influenced by Indian nationalism, at points in time challenged by other nationalist movements, whether it be the Dravidian movement, whether it be the, well, for a while the South Indian Muslim League, but it really didn't go very far. So this was one of those issues that I do pick up on in my book. Because I think it's an issue that exists, that sometimes not been sufficiently discussed in scholarly literature. And then I think there is another aspect, which I think bears mention, which is sensitive in some senses to today, which is the issue of migration and new diasporas in it. Now, without putting or without pushing aside the issue that we've gone through 30 years of 50 years of nation building now, the issue of new migrants and old migrants is certainly a very sensitive issue in Singapore today, but it is not just today that this happens. In my book, you will find references how in 1880s and 1890s, local educated are saying, why are you bringing in this Sudanese? Why are you bringing in these madrasis? 1880s, 1890s. We should be recruiting, I don't know if the exact terms were used at that point in time, but effectively the sons of the soil. This is 1880s, 1890s. In late 1930s, Mr. Jumungo is here. His dad put up two resolutions. If I'm right, I mean, or at least of what I've read is right. Put up two resolutions, and in which there was now a radical wing within the Indian Association, made up of people who just arrived from India, who were very strongly influenced by Indian nationalism. And he said that these are new arrivals. We shouldn't be allowing them to have the same voting rights until, unless they have stayed in this colony for 5 years. It was thrown out. The new arrivals won. So these are some of the distinctive features of the diaspora, some of which I've tried to explore, showing that many of the patterns of the old are relevant even today.
Thank you, Rajesh. I mean, yeah, sure.
The other element was the Brahminic and the non-Brahminic technique. Early on, the Brahminic influence was so great that it led to Periyar. The Periyar movement coming in was challenged. And that led to the development of newspapers which espoused one cause or another. So these were elements of tension and contention.
Thank you. These are complex issues, as you both rightly pointed out. We all continue to struggle with them. Sorry to put you on the spot, but thank you. Any further questions? Do you have a question? Sorry, hold on. Was there a hand here somewhere? There, okay, maybe please give him the mic first and then we'll come to you.
I have not read a book, but I don't know whether you have any section on the Chettiars, especially the Indian relationship with the Chinese and so on. Before the banks were all developed, I think the Chettiars are the one who the Chinese merchants all go to for loans and so on. And also some other trade I am not aware. But any comment in your book on the relationship of the Indians with other communities in Singapore?
Plenty of references to Chettiars. In fact, before the banks came in, they were the official lenders of money, not only to the Indian community, but the other communities who had to set up businesses alone. So there's plenty of it. You can't escape that. That was the time. And of course, over time they gained a reputation which was not all that good, but who loves a person who gives you money and asks for it back?
Well put.
Okay, I'll try to answer your second part. So thank you for the Chettiars. The other issue is about connections between different communities. I tried to do that. I mean, there were certain things that really caught my attention and I ended up spending a bit more time. The connections, for example, between Chinese and Indian secret society. Because until I got to it, I didn't even know there were Indian secret society. But here were the white flags and red flags connecting with the Topecom and the Gihin and so on and so forth, and how they control territories. These were things that I was interested about. But there's more than that, of course. What is really interesting for me is how connections prior to the late 19th century occurred, if I can say, and maybe I'm not using the right words, in the vernacular. And then post 20th century, that whilst, of course, the connections in the vernacular continued, that it sometimes was mediated by English education. So cosmopolitanism and hybridity would take the form of connections through, for example, the Straits Association, and educated English-speaking people connected. But there was a 19th century connection that took place amongst people who could just speak the vernacular. And I think that too is really interesting, and it needs more study, I think.
Thank you, Rajesh. It might look like I'm moderating the time here, but actually I'm being moderated by higher powers. So, sorry that you have a question. A quick one, please.
Hi, I'm Shorodhi Bhattacharya, PhD student at the South Asian Studies program in the US. So, my question to you, Dr. Rai, is that how Indian were the Indians in Singapore? I mean, in a way that, well, I can understand around the 20th century, there is this imagined feeling, community feeling, but since you're also talking about early 19th century, so from which parts of India did they come, and how Indian were they? As in, did the fellow feeling of being Indian happen through historical process? So,
thank you.
Tough one. Many, Anand Young, who writes on transported convicts, said that Hindustan was formed in the convict colony long before Hindustan came to the fore in India. For they spoke common languages, they celebrated each other's festivals, and so on. It's a difficult issue to answer. I think it is, again, it needs to be contextualized according to specific time periods. But one of the strengths that you do see is that socio-political developments there very quickly transfer here also. So as nationalism grows within the Indian context, so too does it become evident here. And to some extent, this issue happens a bit faster in diaspora, partly because of the difference that exists with others. With the fact that you are a minority within this widely Asian and different communities that serves as a force to bring groups together. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. I do want to turn to the audience for any final question or comment that you may have suddenly brought up that you must raise. Okay, so can I just ask if the two panelists have anything to add? Are you done? Ambassador? Rajesh, would you like to say something in closing? Okay, fine. So, since there are no further comments or questions, please join me in thanking a wonderful panel.
Thank you, Professor Sinha, for getting a very lively discussion and for responding equally engaging and interesting remarks and comments. I also take this opportunity to thank the National Museum of Singapore for generously provided this most appropriate venue for this event. Express this gratitude to the Deputy Director of this Library. It is now my privilege to invite Dr. Rai to deliver his vote of thanks.
Okay, I hope you'll allow me this indulgence before I go into the vote of thanks. I think maybe you might just want to hear a bit about this book in terms of directly from words here. This, although it's in the acknowledgements, is for me a very important section. And it's a page that is the most personal story, and the only personal story really within this book. And I would like to share it. The book starts with, in the stillness of the night, sometime before World War I, young Kanta, barely 15, quietly left his home in Raiti village, now in contemporary Eastern UP. He had been married only the day before and was scheduled to escort his bride to her new home. His mind, however, was set on another journey, to a land he had heard of only in whispers and rumors, where kinsmen were said to have prospered and where ordinary men could amass great wealth and become prominent landowners. For months, he had planned his escape. Arriving at the nearby town of Mona Bhanjan before daybreak, he traveled by train to Banaras and thence to Kolkata. His wedding gifts paid for his ship journey to Singapore, a crossing eventually delayed when he was stranded for 3 months in Yangon. When he had finally arrived at the bustling port city, he served as a delivery boy at the post office and at night as an assistant watchman in a go-down by the river. Gradually, he accumulated capital and with the help of new friends embarked on a money-lending business. He would return to India in the late 1920s, departing again to Singapore, this time with his wife. Theirs was a story of migratory success. Together they had 8 children, and Kanta's business blossomed. By the 1960s, he owned several shophouses in Singapore, a modest hotel in Kolkata, and 100 hectares of land in and around Raini, where he also established a school. The roots of and journeys within this book are inextricably tied to the legend of Kanta Rai, the author's grandfather. And now for the formal thanks. Many institutions and people have contributed to the making of this book and enabling the launch at the National Museum, and it's a pleasure to express my gratitude formally. The Faculty of Arts and Social Science, National University of Singapore, generously supported my research, enabling lengthy spells of archival work abroad. The Institute of South Asian Studies graciously hosted me for a writing fellowship over 6 months in 2011, which facilitated the completion of several chapters of the book, and for this I would like especially to thank Investor Philip and Professor Tan Tai Yong for enabling this. Throughout this passage, my colleagues and friends at the South Asian Studies program at NUS have been a source of inspiration and motivation. I am grateful to successive head of departments at SASP who have nurtured my academic development. Professors Peter Reeves, Ganesh Kudesia, Yongman Chong, and Vinita Singh. A special word of thanks is also due to Professor A.R. Venkatachalapati for his expert guidance at the India Office Collections of the British Library, and to Andrea Pinckney for her detailed comments and preliminary drafts, Professors Rahul Mukherjee, Jayati Bhattacharya, Dr. S.P. Pinnapan, Indivar Kamtekar, Vishnu Mohapatra, Kaushal Shakir, all helped in various ways, offering advice, discussing ideas, aiding in translation, and providing references. To this, I must add Ms. Janma for unstinting administrative support. I must also list a number of graduate and undergraduate students who provided valuable research assistance, fantastic Li Wei-Feng, William Chong, Vidya, Praveen, Mohammad Ashraf, Trendy Tan, and specifically, and I'm so glad she's here, Mamta, Rupwani, and Praveen Mukti. Their excellent suggestions and interventions have certainly also strengthened the manuscript. With regards to the launch, I am grateful to Ambassador Kesavani for the great honor for gracing this occasion as guests of honor, and Dr. Sindapal Singh and Dr. Lavanya Kadirvedu for so readily agreeing to speak as panelists, and again to Prof. Sinha for acceding to chair the event. A special thanks to Your Excellency Mrs. Vijay Thakur Singh for her presence here today. I must also thank Johnson and Sitara and the National Museum of Singapore and the administrators from ISIS and SASB for facilitating the launch of this book at this historical site. Finally, I think I should not forget I remain indebted to my family for their guidance and support, my parents and siblings who have been the pillars of my fortitude, and above all, Anu, she's here, my life partner who has throughout this journey shouldered so much of the responsibility of raising our young daughters, Nikita and Siona. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this event. Can I remind you that the book is available at the back of the counter at the back. Please complete drop your completed evaluation form as you go out to the registration box. And last but not least, I would like to invite all of you to a tea reception outside this hall. Thank you very much.